I really don't like looking for assets. Most of the time, I'll choose to make my own just so I can avoid asset browsing. So the other day when I was trying to find some free splatter textures, it's no surprise that I spent hours creating this splatter generator instead. Here in the Northeast, I can feel autumn in the air, which means Halloween is coming, so maybe you guys can use this to fill your spooky scenes with oozing slime or blood splatters. If you don't want to follow along, you can also snag this generator on Gumroad. Here's a quick summary of what we'll be doing. First, we'll make a plane and set it up so a camera is looking directly at it. Then we'll use a noise texture for streaks and a Voronoi texture for droplets. These shapes are easier to see if we put them through a math node set to less than. We can mix between the streaks and droplets by using a gradient as a mask. We don't want our texture to go off the edge, so we can make a circle with a length node and use that as a mask. You can mix any of this with noise if you want more irregularity. Next, we'll make every frame have a random value. We can achieve this by using a white noise texture and plugging it into any value we want to randomize. We can even randomize the color. Then I'll show you how to export these textures so you can use them in other programs. Alright, let's get started. So I'm using Blender 2.93 for this one, and I basically just deleted everything in the scene right here. So first thing we're going to do is add in a plane like that. You can just leave it where it is, same size, no adjustments. I'm also going to add in a camera right here. And with the camera selected, just hit Alt-G and Alt-R, and that'll reset the location and rotation, and you can just drag it up a little bit. It really doesn't matter how far, because what we're going to do when we look through it is we're going to change this to orthographic, and we'll just have to mess with the scale right here. But first, I want to make sure that our camera is the same shape as our plane. I'm going to be exporting square images, so I want to make sure our camera has a square aspect ratio. So I'll just change both of these to 1024, like that. And back over here in Object Data Properties, we can just set orthographic to 2. And this is basically just showing a 2 by 2 meter range, which is the exact same size as our plane. So it should just line up perfectly like that. And that's pretty much all the scene setup we have to do. So I'm going to go into the shading tab up here, and you just want to select your plane and hit new over here to make a new material. So this is going to be our splatter generator. I'm just going to look through the camera with 0, and I'm going to turn off these overlays and gizmos up here just so we don't have too much clutter going on. Okay, so I'm going to delete the principled BSDF. We can always bring that in later if we want it, but for this one I'm going to use a mix shader, and we're going to be mixing a transparent BSDF right here and an emission. And we can switch between the two with this factor right here, but you can see it's not actually turning transparent, and that's because in Eevee what you have to do is select your object once again, hit N over here, it'll open up this side panel, and then I think it's under View, it's under Options. You can go to Blend Mode right here and change that to Alpha Blend. And when you do that, it will actually give you transparency. So we can plug in textures into this factor, and that's exactly what we're going to be doing. So I'm going to bring in a noise texture, and you can just plug the factor directly into the factor right here. It's just looking kind of cloudy, so what we're going to do is bring in a math node, place it right in there, and you can change this to less than. And I'm just going to leave this set to 0.5. This is basically just saying anything that's less than 0.5 make black, and anything that's more than 0.5 make white. And it's just resulting in this hard edge right here. So for this, I'm going to turn the detail down to something like 0.5, so it's pretty smooth. But you can see when you turn it down to 0, you get some hard edges, so I like to not turn it down to 0, just a little higher than 0. And if you have the Node Wrangler add-on installed, which you can just get to by going to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and searching for Node Wrangler, you can just select your texture and hit Control-T, and it will connect it to this texture coordinate. And I want to be using the object texture coordinate like that. And I want these to look like streaks. So to do that, I'm just going to change this X scale right here to 3. And you can see it'll just kind of elongate them a little more. And if you want to mess with the scale, you totally can. I'll just change this to 3 for now. Another thing you can do with the Node Wrangler is make reroute nodes. You hold Shift and right click and drag like that, and it will create these little dots that you can move around with G. So I'm going to just create one right there, because then we can also use Lazy Connect, which is Alt, right click and drag, to connect that to different things, which I'm going to use for a Voronoi texture right here. I'm just going to bring that in and lazy connect that over here. And we can mix these two textures together with a mix RGB like that. I'm going to plug the noise into color 1 and the Voronoi distance into color 2 right there. And you can see we can switch between the two with this factor slider, and we're going to control that with a gradient. So for that, I'm going to bring in a separate XYZ right here, and we can just plug the object texture into there. And if we use Control and Shift and left click, we can preview these. So I want this to go up and down, so I don't want the X, I want the Y right here. So I'll plug the Y right here into the factor and we can take a look at it. So this is basically doing what we want, except I want all these droplets to be at the bottom. So to flip this upside down, I'm gonna bring in a map range right here. And I'm just gonna change the 2 min and the 2 max. I'm just gonna flip them around. So instead of 0 to 1, I'm gonna make it go from 1 to 0. And that's basically just gonna flip this upside down. It's just gonna make the black part white and the white part black. And we can also use this to adjust its position too. So instead of going from 0 to 1, I'm gonna make it go from -1 to +1. And it's a little closer to the center. If you wanna move this up and down, you can just click and drag till both of these are selected like that. And then you can drag left and right to make it go up and down like that. But I'm gonna leave mine at these values right here. I think that's fine for now. I want my droplets to be smaller. I'll make this 10 like that. So if I'm gonna export any of these textures, I don't really want anything touching the edges right here. So I need to create another mask. I'm gonna place this right after this mix RGB node. So we can change this to white, and we can control where we want our texture to be with the factor slider right here. That's where we're gonna plug our next texture into. Our next texture is gonna be circular, and to make that, we're gonna bring in a vector math node. We can just plug that in here. And instead of add, we're gonna change this to length right here. It's basically just gonna show us the distance to our origin point. And when we're using object texture coordinates, by default for a plane, that's gonna be in the very center. So it's just gonna create a circle from the very center. So we can plug that into the factor right here. And when we take a look, you're gonna see everything is clustered in the center, but it's really little. So again, we can adjust that with a map range node right here. And you can clear all these values with backspace. I'm just gonna change the from min to 0.5. You can see it's already getting bigger. And I'm gonna change the from max to 0.9 like that. And you can pretty much just adjust this to whatever size you want, just like we did before. I also wanna change this from linear to smoother step. It just creates a slightly smoother fall off right here. So we have everything clustered in the middle now, but it's pretty obvious that this is just a very clean circle. So to break that up, I'm gonna bring in another noise texture right here. I'm just gonna make some space like that. And once again, just make sure your texture coordinate is plugged in right there. Just duplicate this mix RGB right here. Make sure that this is plugged into the factor. And the noise texture we can plug into here. So let's take a look at our noise texture. This is what we have right here. I'm gonna bring in another map range because I want this to be a little sharper. So I'll look through here and I'll just make this 0.5 and from max 0.6 like that. So it's a little harder edge. And I'll set the scale to 1.5, so it's a much bigger texture. Now let's take a look at this, see what we have. One other thing that I like to do, instead of just using the factor, is we can use the color. But first I'm gonna use a separate RGB. You can see when we preview the color, it is just colorful blobs. But when we plug this into the separate RGB, it'll give us 3 separate grayscale values. So this is the R, which is what the factor is using by default. And then we have the G, which is slightly different, and the B, which is again slightly different, but they all have the same scale. Instead of using a bunch of different noise textures, we can just use one and just separate it with the separate RGB. And this will make it a little faster in the viewport for us. And for the map range, I'll set the from minimum to 0.5 and the from max, I'll just keep at 1. So now you can see when we preview it, it's not as obvious that it's just a straight circle like that. Next, I'm gonna create a little irregularity. I don't want every texture to look like a circle. So I'm gonna use this noise texture to add some distortion. So first we'll distort our circle right here. And to do that, I'm gonna bring in a mapping node right here. And we're gonna change the scale, because I want it to be branching out from the center, and scale works best for that. So I'm gonna bring in a combine XYZ like that. And we just wanna set all of these to 1 because that's the default scale value. And I'm just gonna take this G channel from our noise texture and I'm gonna plug it into the X and to the Y. And you can see it's already starting to distort, but I wanna be able to control how strong the distortion is. So to do that, we need a math node. You can just drag it in here. And I'm gonna set this to multiply add. So we always want to add 1 at the end so that it goes back to the normal value if we multiply it by 0 like that. So this would just be like we didn't change anything, but we can change the multiply value to add distortion, but you can see it's pulling in and pulling out. If you don't want that to happen, you have to add 1 more math node, which is just a subtract, and you can set this value to 0.5. And when you do that, now it won't really, get smaller or bigger. It just pushes in both directions. I'm just gonna set this to something like 1, and you can see it's just a slightly different shape now. We can also do this to make our gradient right here a little messier. So I'm gonna set this back to -1 and 1 like that. So it's just like right in the middle, 0 to 1. And to distort this, we're gonna do a very similar thing, but instead of a mapping node, we can just use a vector math set to add, and we can plug some noise into that second slot right here, and you'll see it's gonna start to distort like that. And we can do the same thing we did before with a math node. So we can use a multiply for the strength. And if we want it to not go up and down like that, once again, we can just have a subtract set to 0.5. So now you can see it should be fine like that. So let's see how this looks now, and if we need to adjust this at all. Maybe I'll set this -1 to 0 like that, something like that. So now you can see we have some drips, and at the bottom we have some splatters, but it's not as regular now. I'm actually going to turn this up quite a bit higher so that sometimes we have drips down low, sometimes we have them up high. I think that's good. So you can use this setup to pretty much distort any textures you want. You just want to make sure that you put it before your texture. I have quite a few videos where I talk just about this, and I have some free node groups that you can download from Gumroad that are made to do exactly this. So now we have our basic splatter texture right here, and if we want to change the color, you can just change this emission to whatever color you want. So if you want it to look like blood, you can do it like that, and now we have blood splatter. Or you could make it something like green slime and turn the emission up a little higher like that so it glows. But I'm making a splatter generator, so I don't want just one splatter texture. I want to make a whole bunch of them. So the next part is about how to randomize. So the way we can do that is with a white noise texture right here, and we can just set this from 3D to 1D right there. And when we take a look at this and we change this W value, it's just gonna give us random values between 0 and 1. We also have this color output right here, which is just like the noise texture, where it's just 3 random values put together, and each of those values is between 0 and 1. So we can make a separate RGB like that and plug the color in, and we'll have 3 different grayscale values now that we can use to randomize things. And to get a random value for each frame, we can just type in here hash frame like that and hit enter, and this will add a driver that matches the value of this to whatever frame you're on. You can see when I move frames, it's gonna just be the same value as the frame. And if you don't want this to be flashing like crazy like that, you can just turn your frame rate down. Over at output properties, you can do custom, and I like to just set this to something like 4, just so it's not flashing like really fast. All right, so now you can pretty much just plug these values into any spot you want to randomize. So what I want to do is randomize the Voronoi and noise texture. I'm just going to bring in a vector math node right here, and you can just plug one of these values. I'll plug the B value in like that. And when we look at this, you can see every frame will be slightly different, but this isn't moving it very far. So if you want it to be more extreme, you can just bring in a math node and set it to, I usually set it to multiply and just put in a really high value. So I'll just put in like 1,000. And that'll just make it a little more, it'll just add more variation basically. So now these two textures should be random for every frame, but I also want to change this noise texture, so we can do the same exact thing that I just did, like this. I'll just duplicate both of these over, and we can plug one of these values into the multiply and then into that add node right here. And now each frame will be slightly different too. And it's also changing the distortion of our circle right here too. And this will just help make things look a lot more random for each frame. If you want to use any of these values to randomize things like the scale, but you don't want it to be completely random, you want it to be in a certain value range, for that you can use the map range node. Let's check out this noise texture. Say like, I'd be okay with going as low as 2 and maybe as high as 5. So over here, you just want to change the 2 minimum and the 2 maximum. So I can just set that from the minimum to 2 and the maximum to 5, like that. We can plug in one of these random values. So I'll take the G, plug it into the value, and then we can plug this into the scale right there. And now we'll have some scale variation. So you can see this one is like skinnier, longer streaks, and then this one is bigger, and we'll just have some random ones mixed in there. We can do the same thing for the Voronoi. I'd be okay with this going as high as 15 maybe. You can see if you turn it up too high, it just starts to look kind of weird. And maybe something lower, like maybe like 5 to 15, like that. And we can just take one of these other values and plug that into the scale. So now sometimes we'll have little droplets and other times we'll have bigger ones. Like that. So this is getting pretty random now. The only other thing that I would like to randomize is the color, which is pretty easy because we have this color output right here, so we can have a completely random color if we want. Basically what I'm going to do is get a combine HSV right here. That's hue, saturation, and value. And I'm going to plug the R, G, and B values in here. And this is just so I have a little more control over if I want to change the saturation of the value. And I'll show you what I mean. I'm just going to bring this over here so we can plug it into our emission. So you can see each frame, we're going to have a completely different value. But you can see some of these are kind of muted, some of them are kind of dark or kind of pale, and that's completely fine. But say for instance you don't want any of these to be black, you can just unplug the value right here and make sure this is set to 1, and it will always be the maximum lightness value basically. So you can see now when we're going through here, we don't have any black ones. You could also do this too if you want all of them to be really dark. You could do like 0.1 or something, and we'll have only dark colors in here, which is pretty cool. We can do the same thing with saturation. Say if we just want to alter the hue, but we want the saturation and the value to be all the way up. So we're just going to have really bright, powerful colors now, but each one will be slightly different. So I like to use the combine HSV method, just so you have a little control. Okay, next I'll show you how to export all of these textures. So you're probably going to want these to have a transparent background. So you can go up here to render properties. I'm going to shut bloom off. And I want to go down to film and turn on transparent. And you can see when we switch over to rendered view, our background has that grid pattern, and that means the background is transparent. So then we can go to output properties right here. You just want to make sure you have your resolution set. I'm just going to leave mine to 1024 like that. That's basically like a 1K texture. So you want to set your destination. I'm just going to put mine on the desktop in a folder called Splatter like that. And accept. If you want the background to be transparent, make sure you choose RGBA like that. And I'm going to turn compression all the way down. All right, next we just have to figure out how many frames we want. So if I want 100 frames, I can come in here and just fill in 100 like that. So now we'll have 100 frames. And now with everything set up, we can pretty much just go to render animation. And you can see our folder is just going to start filling up with a bunch of random textures. You can use these for like whatever you want. You can use these for games. You can use them in Blender just as decals. In my last video, I used this add-on called the Ike add-on that was really good for placing decals and things like that. So you could use these for pretty much anything. And now you just have an unlimited supply of them. One other thing that's worth mentioning is if you want to use these just like in Blender and you want to like place them around and stuff like that, you can see that when I duplicate it, it's just going to make the same texture over and over again. So if you want that to not be the case, basically instead of using this white noise as a value, you could instead bring in, I think it's called object info, and use random object right here. This is not a color value, but you can still plug it in here and it'll work fine. And this is going to give you a random value between 0 and 1 for every object you have in your scene. So you can see now that each of these is different now. And when you hit play, they're not going to be constantly changing either, which is cool. Because if you're using the white noise, we have the driver set up, each of these is always going to be different for every frame. So using the random object value is going to be a lot better if you're not planning on exporting these and you just want to bring in a plane with this texture on it and scatter them around that way instead. And it's also kind of nice because you can zoom in really far and you don't really have to worry about resolution because it'll always be crisp. But if you are using them in your scene that way, you might want to use a shader that can handle reflections. So you could use a principled BSDF. This less than value, you can just plug into the alpha and that should create the transparency just fine. You just have to wait for the shaders to compile down here. So yeah, you can see now. And we can just turn the roughness all the way down. Let's look at this from a different angle. We're getting some reflections now. And we can just change this to like whatever color we want. And if it looks too flat, we can use this texture right here as our bump value, which is pretty cool. So I'll just bring in a bump node right here, plug that into the normal, and we can just plug this texture in to the height right there. And let's take a look. It's probably going to be way too strong because we need to change some values around. You can see it's already starting to look pretty 3D. To make this not as pointy, what I like to do is bring in a RGB curves like this. And by default, all of these will just have linear values. So you can just create a point, and I usually pull it up here so it's very round like that. You can just set the X to 0.25 and the Y to 0.75 like that. So it'll look a little more round, but this is still very strong. So the distance, I think you can set to something pretty low, like 0.05, something like that. And it won't look nearly as intense. You can see we still have some sharp spots right here where droplets are touching. You can make so it's only the edges that look like they have bump and the rest is flat. For that, I usually use a map range. So yeah, you can restrict some values. I think it's the from min right here. You can just turn that up to however high you want. So maybe like 0.4, like that. And you can see it's only at the edges now, but the linear fall off is making it look kind of weird. So we can change that to smoother step. And, you know, obviously feel free to mess with these values quite a bit. You could just turn the strength down like that so it's more subtle. So yeah, feel free to play with these values at all too. There's probably a better way to do it to make sure that these are actually smoothing together instead of just being a hard edge. But yeah, that's it for this one. Once again, you can get this texture generator on Gumroad along with a bunch of other stuff. Some of it's free. All right, thanks for watching. Have a good one.